For 8 hours straight, Matthew Perry gave away money to every homeless person he could find. $100 here, $200 there. By sunset, he was broke, but he wasn't crazy. He was trying to save his own life. October 15th, 2001. The morning started like countless others in Matthew Perry's life during the darkest period of his prescription drug addiction, with a handful of pills, a crushing sense of worthlessness, and the familiar weight of another day he wasn't sure he wanted to face. But this particular Monday would be different from all the others, not because Matthew planned anything unusual, but because a moment of devastating clarity would drive him to do something so extreme that witnesses would think he was having a complete mental breakdown. Matthew had woken up at 6 a.m. in his Malibu beach house, not from restful sleep, but from the anxious half-consciousness that had become his normal state. His body was dependent on a cocktail of painkillers that required constant management to avoid withdrawal, but his tolerance had grown so high that the pills no longer provided relief. They simply kept him functional enough to get through each day. On this particular morning, as Matthew sat on the edge of his bed staring at the bottle of OxyContin in his hand, something shifted in his perception. Instead of seeing the pills as his lifeline, he suddenly saw them as they really were, the thing that was slowly killing him, one day at a time, stealing his humanity and turning him into someone he no longer recognized. The realization hit him with devastating force. He wasn't living. He was just existing. He wasn't creating anything meaningful or helping anyone or making any kind of positive difference in the world. He was simply consuming resources, taking up space, and slowly destroying himself while people around him pretended not to notice. In that moment of brutal self-awareness, Matthew made a decision that seemed logical to his drug-addled mind, but would appear completely irrational to everyone else. If he was worthless, if his money was just enabling his destruction, if his wealth was meaningless in the face of his addiction, then he would get rid of it, all of it. He would give away everything he had until there was nothing left, and maybe then he would be forced to either get clean or die trying. Matthew got dressed, drove to his bank in Beverly Hills, and withdrew $23,000 in cash, nearly his entire checking account balance. The teller looked concerned as she counted out the large sum of money, but Matthew was a recognizable celebrity with a legitimate account, so she processed the transaction without asking questions. From the bank, Matthew drove to Sunset Boulevard, one of the areas in Los Angeles with the highest concentration of homeless individuals. He parked his car and began walking, looking for people who appeared to need help. It didn't take long. The first person he encountered was a middle-aged woman sitting outside a convenience store with a cardboard sign asking for food money. Matthew approached her nervously, pulled out a $100 bill, and handed it to her. "Here," he said simply. "Please take this." The woman stared at the money in disbelief. She probably hadn't seen a $100 bill in months, maybe years. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is a lot of money." "I'm sure," Matthew replied. "You need it more than I do." What followed was 8 hours of the most emotionally intense experiences of Matthew's life. He walked up and down Sunset Boulevard, then moved to Hollywood Boulevard, then to downtown Los Angeles, systematically finding homeless individuals and giving them significant amounts of cash. To each person he met, Matthew gave between $50 and $300, depending on their apparent circumstances and needs. A man with children received $300. An elderly woman with obvious health problems received $200. Young people got $100. Everyone got something. But what made this more than just an unusual act of charity was Matthew's emotional state during the process. With each person he helped, with each grateful smile and shocked thank you, Matthew felt something he hadn't experienced in months, a sense of purpose. For the first time in his addiction, he was doing something that made a positive difference in someone else's life. Thank you so much," said a young man who hadn't eaten in 2 days. "You don't know what this means." But Matthew did know what it meant. It meant that his existence wasn't completely pointless. It meant that his wealth could do something good in the world. It meant that even in his broken state, he could still help someone else. As the day progressed, word began to spread among the homeless community that there was someone giving away serious money. People started approaching Matthew instead of him seeking them out. By afternoon, there was a small crowd following him as he walked through downtown LA. Some of the people he encountered told him their stories. A veteran who had been living on the streets for 3 years after losing his job and apartment, a woman who had been evicted and was living in her car with her teenage daughter, an elderly man who was trying to save enough money to buy medication for his diabetes. Each story hit Matthew like a physical blow, not because they were uniquely tragic. Homelessness was unfortunately common in Los Angeles, but because they reminded him of his own vulnerability. He realized that he was closer to these people than he was to the wealthy celebrities in his social circle. Addiction had stripped away most of his dignity and self-respect. Only his money had kept him from losing everything else. "I've been where you are," Matthew found himself telling a young man who was clearly struggling with substance abuse. "Not exactly, but close. I know what it's like to feel like you've lost everything." The young man, who had initially been suspicious of Matthew's motives, started crying. "Nobody's been this kind to me in years," he said. "Most people look at me like I'm not even human." By 6 p.m., Matthew had given away nearly all of his cash. He had about $500 left, and the sun was beginning to set over Los Angeles. He was exhausted, emotionally drained, and completely broke by his standards, but he felt more alive than he had in months. That's when he encountered Maria Santos, a 34-year-old woman sitting outside Union Station with her 2 young children, ages 6 and 8. She was holding a sign that read, "Anything helps. God bless." The children were clean and well-behaved, but clearly hungry and tired. Matthew approached Maria carefully. He could see that she was trying to maintain dignity in an impossible situation, and he didn't want to embarrass her or make her feel like a charity case. "Excuse me," he said gently. "I wondered if I could help you and your children with anything." Maria looked up at him suspiciously. She had learned to be wary of strangers who approached her, especially men. "What do you want?" she asked. "I don't want anything," Matthew said. "I just have some money that I'd like to share with you, if you're comfortable with that." Matthew pulled out the remaining $500 and handed it to Maria. Her reaction was immediate and overwhelming. She started crying so hard that her children became alarmed and moved closer to comfort her. "Why?" she asked through her tears. "Why are you doing this?" Matthew sat down on the sidewalk next to her, not caring about his expensive clothes or what passers-by might think. "Because I've been lost too," he said. "Not in the same way, but lost. And today I learned that helping other people is the only thing that makes me feel found." Maria told Matthew her story. She had been working as a hotel housekeeper until she lost her job 6 months earlier. She couldn't afford rent on her unemployment benefits, had been evicted from their apartment, and had been staying in homeless shelters when space was available. Her children were missing school, and she was terrified that social services would take them away if they couldn't find stable housing soon. "This money," Maria said, clutching the $500. "This will get us into a motel for a week. Maybe 2 weeks if we're careful. That's enough time for me to find a job." Matthew felt something break open inside his chest, not breaking in a destructive way, but breaking open like a shell that had been protecting something tender and valuable. For 8 hours, he had been giving away money to help other people, but in this moment, he realized that they had been helping him far more than he had been helping them. Every person he had met that day had thanked him with genuine gratitude and human warmth. They had treated him not as a celebrity or a drug addict or a failure, but as a person who had shown them kindness when they needed it most. They had given him something that no amount of pills could provide, a sense of worth that came from outside himself. As Matthew drove home that night with empty pockets and a full heart, he understood something about his addiction that years of therapy hadn't been able to teach him. His drug use wasn't just about numbing physical pain or managing anxiety. It was about trying to fill a spiritual emptiness that came from feeling disconnected from other people and from any sense of meaning or purpose. But spending the day helping people had connected him to something larger than his own problems. It had reminded him that he had value as a human being, not because of his fame or wealth or talent, but because he had the capacity to ease someone else's suffering. When Matthew arrived home, he found 17 messages on his answering machine. His accountant had called multiple times in panic after noticing the large cash withdrawal. His assistant was worried because he hadn't answered his phone all day. His agent wanted to discuss an upcoming appearance. Matthew deleted all the messages without listening to them completely. For the first time in months, other people's demands on his time and attention felt less important than what he had just experienced. That night, Matthew didn't take his usual handful of pills. Not because he had decided to quit cold turkey. He wasn't that naive about the realities of physical dependence, but because he didn't feel the overwhelming emptiness that usually drove him to medicate himself into unconsciousness. Instead, he sat on his deck overlooking the Pacific Ocean and thought about the 23 people he had met that day. He wondered if Maria had found a motel room for her children. He hoped the elderly diabetic man would be able to buy his medication. He thought about the young veteran and wondered what support services might be available to help him. For the first time in his addiction, Matthew fell asleep naturally, without pills, thinking about other people instead of his own problems. The next morning, Matthew called his therapist and scheduled an emergency session. He needed to talk about what had happened the day before and what it might mean for his recovery. "I gave away everything," he told Dr. Karen Winters. $23,000 in 8 hours. I know how that sounds, but it wasn't a manic episode or a breakdown. It was the first time I've felt human in months. Dr. Winters listened carefully as Matthew described his experience. She had been working with him for 6 months, watching him struggle with the isolation and self-hatred that were feeding his addiction. What she heard in his voice that day was different, not the desperate grasp for meaning that characterized many of his previous attempts at recovery, but a genuine shift in perspective. "What do you think you learned about yourself?" she asked. "That my addiction isn't just about the pills," Matthew said. "It's about feeling worthless and disconnected from everything good in the world. But yesterday I felt connected again. I felt useful. I felt like maybe I'm not completely broken." Dr. Winters recognized this as a breakthrough moment. Many people struggling with addiction get trapped in cycles of self-focus that make recovery more difficult. Matthew's spontaneous day of giving had broken him out of that cycle and reminded him of his capacity for positive action in the world. "How do you want to build on this experience?" she asked. Matthew thought for a moment. "I want to keep helping people. Not necessarily by giving away money. I can't afford to do that every day, but I want to find ways to be useful to people who need help." That conversation led to Matthew volunteering at homeless shelters, participating in addiction recovery support groups, and eventually becoming an advocate for mental health and addiction services. But it all started with one day when his pain became so overwhelming that his only relief came from trying to relieve someone else's pain. The story of Matthew Perry giving away all his money isn't just about a celebrity having an unusual breakdown. It's about the moment when someone who had lost all sense of worth discovered that their value as a human being wasn't determined by what they accomplished or accumulated, but by their willingness to show up for other people when they needed help most. Years later, when Matthew spoke publicly about his addiction recovery, he would often reference that day as a turning point. "I thought I was saving them by giving them money," he would say. "But they saved me by showing me that I still had something valuable to offer the world, even at my lowest point." Matthew Perry was caught giving away all his money on the street because he was trying to find a reason to stay alive. What he found instead was that the reason had been there all along. He just had to step outside of his own pain long enough to see someone else's.